So the thing about the cell phones reminds me when so I have, from my bio you saw that I have this long career doing a lot of different things. So I did a 2-year college program at Sir Sandford Fleming in Ontario before I made my way into academia. And there's this apocryphal story that one of the professors told us where he had a teacher, apparently in the early days of cell phones, who would get a grad student to sit in class with an old cell phone, a cell phone that was no longer useful, and have it ring in class. And the teacher would apparently then take that phone and smash it in front of all the other students. And then everyone would be like, "Whoa, don't mess around in their class." And so we were obviously impressed and taken aback. And the more I've thought about it, the crazier that story actually seems. But I just wanted to start off with a funny joke because that's what they tell you to do. So, so as Mark said, my name is Simon Goring. I am in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin, and I want to talk about some of my experiences working there and working with a number of large-scale projects. I've had the advantage of working with a number of amazing collaborators, and that's meant thinking about large-scale problems in new ways. And one of my focuses in dealing with these issues has really been focusing on some of the infrastructure that we use to actually undertake these projects, both human infrastructure and cyber infrastructure. So I'm going to talk about the sort of scientific advances that we've made, but I'm also going to talk about the ways in which technology has improved our ability to undertake these kinds of research questions. And as I said initially, it wouldn't be without these people that I could do my work. I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without all these people. So I'm going to talk about work that I have done, but I want you to keep in the back of your mind that this work is really reliant on the fact that a large number of people are contributing critical pieces to this kind of research. And similarly, I like to feel that I am contributing critical pieces to their work as well. So these research projects, some of the ones that Mark talked about, really require a large investment in time for a lot of people who just sort of wind up on an acknowledgement slide. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of that later on in my talk. So, as a society, we are faced with large-scale problems. Climate change is happening. Climate change is real. I don't think I need to tell you that. And climate change has a large number of facets, a large number of problems that interact in different ways depending on your viewpoint. And so here we see a forest fire, which may be of concern for us in Vancouver because we have poor air quality and we can't go outside. But for someone who works in the lumber industry, this is a problem because this is a loss of jobs for them. And for someone who works in conservation, maybe this is a good thing because this means that forests are coming through these sort of coming back into natural cycles after centuries of fire suppression. Or maybe this is a catastrophic fire that's followed hundreds of years of fire suppression. And so depending on our viewpoint, we may be addressing similar aspects of this large-scale climate change problem in different ways, and sometimes we may be at odds with each other, and sometimes we may be in agreement, but very rarely are we working on projects that are trying to address all those different facets at the same time. And so we can look at something like climate change, and we can see that there are a large number of groups that did not happen the way I wanted it to. That there are a large number of groups who are interested in questions around climate change who address these questions in different ways. So at the Association of American Geographers, a couple of years ago, I was an invited speaker in a session on the Anthropocene, and I was talking, and one of the speakers in that session was a psychologist who was talking about the psychology of acceptance around climate change and around large-scale disasters. What's it going to take psychologically for us as a society to begin to accept the kinds of things we actually need to do to help abate and adapt to climate change? Obviously, earth sciences is interested in a lot of these questions. Climate modelers, ecologists, political scientists. How do we actually undertake things like the Paris Agreement? Economics, what are the economic costs? And all of these people are using data about climate change, but oftentimes they may be sharing similar pieces of data, like ecologists and earth scientists, or political scientists and ecologists, but we often do that at cross purposes to one another. I may have to analyze a piece of data as an ecologist, the same piece of data that a climate modeler is looking at, and the same piece of data that a political scientist is working on, but because we're in different departments, because we're working on different research questions, we're just replicating the same workflow over and over again. And we may not even be replicating the same workflow. We may be saying that we're doing the same thing, but we're doing it completely different ways. And we may be getting different results as a cause from that. So there's this sort of model of doing things around these big questions or these big problems, and there's this model where you actually get these people working together around a common set of questions and around a common problem, where you make them interdependent so that people are agreeing on the ways to analyze the data and coming to new forms of understanding about the way those data relate to the problem at hand. I just need to make sure I know where I am. But there are huge challenges in terms of how we actually manage this kind of work. And some of these are technical challenges. Those of you who are going into grad school, some of you may have encountered this in undergrad already. Those of you who are setting up large-scale research programs know, when you start thinking about what kind of tools you're going to use to analyze your data, you may be confronted with a huge number of different tools. How do you know which one to pick? Do you pick R? Do you pick Python? Do you use MATLAB? If you're building a database, do you use a graph database? Do you use SQL Server? Do you use Maria database? It can be confounding, and sometimes it doesn't matter. But sometimes you're trying to do big things and you want your results to be sustainable and you want other people to be able to use them. So you need to have some sort of knowledge about how to actually undertake this, the technological development. We also have data challenges. We talk a lot about big data, and there are challenges there in dealing with the volume of data, the velocity of data, how accurate that data is. Those same challenges happen in the long tail as well. And oftentimes now we're tasking students in particular with working with data from both ends. And those have huge challenges, and they're different challenges. And we task one graduate student with it in one department, and they're working with one set of data. And another graduate student is doing the same work in a different department, and they're again repeating this kind of analysis, coming potentially to different answers, and we don't share it because they're in different buildings across departments. So big data is a huge boon to research. We can use remote sensing data, LiDAR data, to answer all sorts of super interesting questions. Big data is enormously valuable, but it also means more time cleaning the data. So there's this estimate, I don't know if you've seen it, that a data scientist spends about 80% of their time, maybe 90% of their time, just doing data cleaning. And I've started some projects that I thought would be really easy. I was talking to Kai about this earlier. We managed to get all of NSF's award data, historical award data, going back to the 1960s. And we were like, oh, I bet we could ask some really cool questions. And we started doing some stuff, and we found these really neat patterns. And then we realized how much of the data had been miscoded, how codes had changed over time, and how like people's names were misspelled sometimes. And as soon as you start getting into that and realizing, yeah, we can see some patterns, but how much of that is a true pattern, and how much of that is just a spurious sort of like, it's significant because you have so much data, but it's probably just because of some sort of data artifact. And there's high processing overloads. They're really sensitive because there's so much data, you can often get significant relationships just because there's so much data, but they're really sensitive to the analytical methods that you actually use. So it's really easy to see significant patterns in there, even if they're not really important. Christine Borgman has thought a lot about data in the long tail. She's a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles. I had the pleasure of seeing her talk at the EarthCube All Hands meeting this year in Seattle. She's done some amazing work thinking about the way that scientists work together and the way that the long tail of data operates. And she has a paper in she has this great book called Big Data, Little Data, and then something else. It's got a subtitle, but it's really good. So she talks about the long tail of data. When you get out into the long tail of data, you're talking about individual data sets in which the methods and tools vary between institutions within research labs. Some of you who run research labs may know that, the first time you run an experiment, the first time you go out and do field work, you run the field work one way. The next year, you've retooled it a little bit, it's slightly different. You're generally getting the same data, but the methods have actually changed. And you do that again, and you do that again, and you do that again, which is partly why some long-term ecological studies are really important. But the other thing is that people will often generate very similar data sets that on the surface of it look almost exactly the same, have similar data models, but they use different techniques to actually generate those. And so that can be problematic as well. You don't always know. Individuals are responsible for their own data management a lot of times in this case. And this means then that when the data are no longer used, once the paper is published, data is lost. This is a figure. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is the figure. It's data entropy. It's by Bill Michener. It's from a paper, it's from a report that he wrote in '96, I think, but then he republished it in Ecological Informatics. And so this is the information content of an individual piece of data, datum, of a data set over time. So you have very high information content right up till the time of publication. Once that paper is published, you begin to forget things. Where exactly in that study site did I place my study sites? What was the weather like? I don't remember. Maybe it was rainy. All those days sort of blended into one. Once people change career, maybe they've changed department, maybe they've gone into an administrative position, maybe they've left academia, we start to lose more data. And then eventually, once they die, most of that information is lost. And at any point in time, you can have an accident where that data is lost very rapidly. And during my PhD, I was collecting pollen records from across British Columbia, and I ran into a number of publications where I couldn't get the data because researchers said, well, actually, I had it stored in my garage, and we had a flood. It was all paper, right? It was all on, the count sheets were all on paper. We had a flood. And we had to get rid of them because they all got moldy and we couldn't keep them. There was a researcher in Western Washington who had done a bunch of work, and they just said, I do agricultural work now. That was 10 years ago. I have no idea where those files are. And this is really problematic because those are important pieces of data. It would be great to have them. It would be great to improve our knowledge, but they get lost over time. And this is a real challenge, especially as we try to do more with our data. On top of these data challenges, there are scientific challenges as well. We're being asked and we're being tasked to do more complex analysis, adding in GIS components, data assimilation if we're doing models, Bayesian analyses, really highly integrated analysis that are taking products from one grad student as they're being developed and being put into a second analysis. So that things have to be highly integrated. Researchers have to be working really closely together. There's a higher reliance on presumed data quality. We're asking much more complex questions of the data that we're generating, and so we need to depend on the fact that it's highly reliable. And finally, we need to know where the data is and what kind of data we should be using. And this is, so I keep wanting to talk about EarthCube things. I'm just going to really briefly say, because I'll talk about EarthCube in a bit. EarthCube is an initiative by the National Sciences Foundation. It's a joint venture between Advanced Cyber Infrastructure and the Geosciences divisions of NSF. It's basically to develop the cyber infrastructure for 21st century geosciences. It's trying to build a new system. It's called EarthCube because what they want to be able to do is be able to visualize the history of the Earth in 4 dimensions. So you should be able to have some sort of internet-connected device and be able to know everything about the place you're in, from the top of the atmosphere to the core, through time. And so this really involves a lot of data connectivity. And one of the things we found in a lot of the case studies we looked at initially was that people really pointed to data discovery as being a significant limitation for their research proposals. If you are an eco-hydrologist, do you know where to find paleoecological data? I mean, you just call me, right, anytime you want it. But you don't know, because that's not your discipline. If I've done a lot of soils work, and I know, I mean, I haven't. I've done a lot of work where I've needed soils data. But there are a bunch of different soils databases. And how do I know which one is the best one to use? How do I know what kind of tools I need to actually analyze that data? When I want climate data, I often go to just Climate BC and PRISM because I know those data sets. But I don't really understand why one is better than, like why WorldClim is maybe better than Climate BC or Climate WNA. So data discovery is a real problem as well. Oh, I just pressed the wrong button, I think. There we go. Okay. And then there are human challenges as well. So when we think about the human challenges, you have to deal with other people. And other people are sometimes super good. And I love working with great people. But sometimes people are crummy. And you got to work with them too, because you are dependent on the work that they do. The costs of interdisciplinary research can also be very high, and some of you, I know, maybe have studied a little bit about interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinary papers often get cited at lower rates than disciplinary papers. That's not always the case, and it's dependent, but there is a general trend. One of the other challenges is when you're working in these highly integrated groups, you may be doing work that is extremely critical to the project, but so are 10 other people. And so when it comes time for publication, you may have been critical, but you weren't the person who wrote the paper. You weren't the person who did whatever. And so you're like 5th on the author list. Doesn't mean you're 5th in terms of importance. It just means that when people are looking at your CV, it doesn't look like you've done as much, because that's the way people look at CVs. That's not the way they should look at them, but that is. And then we talked about data management a little bit, but that's another human challenge. How do you actually manage data across these large projects? How do you share data? Are you just putting things in Dropbox and hoping that people get it? Are you emailing files back and forth and back and forth and back and forth? How are you dealing with this? These are all human challenges to doing this kind of work. So if we really want to start answering some of these big questions, these big problems, in this kind of integrated way, we need to start using new techniques. And once we start adopting these techniques, and once we start adopting these frames of understanding, we suddenly have a whole bunch of new opportunities for discovery. Because if we have enough data, we can do anything we want with it. I mean, we can't do anything, but we can do some really cool stuff. So this comes from IRIS. IRIS is the International Seismographic Information System, Seismology Information System. It's based out of the University of Washington. This is the acceleration spectrogram from a whole bunch of, from one particular seismic meter as Hurricane Harvey hits the Texas coast. I pulled this off of their website. This was generated on the 29th of August. This was all data that came in, was rapidly analyzed, and was able to show this impact, this seismic impact of the hurricane making landfall. This is big data. This is real-time streaming data being analyzed at a rapid pace and then being generated for public consumption. And IRIS has a whole bunch of stations down there. And people can do this at a spatial scale as well. So not just from one individual point, but they can start doing this sort of like three-dimensional wavelet analysis, looking at the impacts in space and time. And there's really cool signatures. Like you can see the diurnal cultural noise. So this is like people waking up and driving around and causing small impacts in the seismic signature. You can see earthquakes from across the world. And as these systems become more integrated and the data becomes available for real-time streaming, you can do lots of really cool stuff with it. I don't know how many of you know about the Climate Corporation. So they are owned by Monsanto. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. But it is a really interesting use case, because what they've done is they have used a bunch of neural network information, a bunch of neural nets, climate data, to do mesoscale climate prediction that they can then provide to farmers to give advice about the best times to fertilize their fields, the best kinds of crops to plant at a particular year, given certain climate projections over months and over like a couple of years. It's certainly problematic because it's owned by Monsanto, and I'm quite sure that I know whose seeds they might be suggesting. But at the same time, this is a real-world example of ways in which data can potentially be harnessed for the public good as well. So if we can provide real-time mesoscale projections of climate that are accurate and use those to guide policy, for example, monsoon predictions, then we can do real good. And so one of the suggestions I've made in the past is that a lot of this data management and human management capacity will come from what I call the middle tail. So here we use the term community curated data resources. We have a paper right now in review that sort of uses that term and defines it more clearly. But the idea is that within disciplinary communities, around a certain type of data, you could develop a community, and that community not only manages that data collectively, but they also build the tools and the capacity for managing that data. So they basically act as an information source for people who choose to use that data in the future. And so they can then place themselves into these circles because they will potentially represent a number of different disciplines. I think about paleoecology as an example. So in paleoecology, we study the ecology of the past. I happen to work with pollen, and so I know about the way that pollen and forests and climate interact, but we also work with vertebrate paleontologists, and we work with people who use diatoms for water chemistry information. They all have the same data model, but they do represent different disciplinary uses, and if we can come to an agreement within the community about what that data model looks like, what sort of standards of community best practice there are, then that makes discoverability of the data much higher, and it makes the ease of use of the data much better as well. And there are a number of examples. I'm just using some ecological examples here. A number of examples that are developing. I am working, so this is neotoma. So the reason we call neotoma, the Neotoma Paleoecological Database neotoma, I'm just going to take a drink of water. Who knows about pack rats and what pack rats do? So pack rats live in the desert. This neotoma in particular lives in the desert. And what they do is they have these middens. So they go out around where they live and they collect little bits of things. They collect seeds, they collect nuts, they collect twigs and leaves, and they bring them back to their midden and they cement it into a giant ball of urine. And they do this over years and years and years. And so you can get these giant concretions of effectively the local environment around that pack rat's midden, and it will include things like pollen, things like plant macrofossils, small mammal fossils as well. It will have isotopic information, which will reflect the regional climate at the time. And that's what the Neotoma Paleoecological Database contains. We do contain information from pack rat middens, but we also contain pollen information. We contain XRF, XRF data. There's isotopic data from bones. And so it winds up representing the whole Earth system from a biological perspective through time. Data Dryad is sort of a catch-all ecological database. There is community curation, but it's a lot broader in terms of its data scope. GBIF is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It uses a common data standard, Darwin Core, to mark up its holdings, but it represents holdings from museums, from field observations, tagged by time, and so you can get a picture of where specimens are globally. And the paleobiology database does a similar thing, but for fossils. And the paleobiology database, we're working with them on something called the Earth Life Consortium, and the goal for this, along with working with GBIF, is to be able to get an understanding of patterns of biodiversity change through time, from the beginnings, from the origins of life to the present, so that you can go to one single platform, the Earth Life Consortium, and do a search and say, show me where Canis has been. And you will get the entire history of the canids from their origin to the present. And this is coming from the middle tail. But to do this kind of work, we basically need to invest not only in the infrastructure, not only in the computational abilities, but also in the human capacity. So it's not enough to train a grad student for 1 year how to do these things. We need to retain them. And we know right now that in academia, salaries for computationally savvy people are not very high in academia, but are very high in the public sector. And we've gone through this problem on our own projects. It's very difficult for us to train and retain technically savvy people, the people who run the back ends of these data services. And this is what NSF realized with EarthCube. So NSF started saying, okay, we can't just keep funding projects based on a single scientific goal. We need to fund projects that really think about architecture, about cyber infrastructure architecture, but with a domain-specific view. So we can't just, we need to think about the earth sciences as a geoinformatics discipline. And so a lot of the projects that are funded, they funded the Earth Life Consortium. There's another project called Geo Deep Dive that we're working with. Geo Deep Dive basically mines the literature. You teach it about what certain data elements look like in text, and then it uses that to build knowledge rules, and then can actually go out and mine the entire corpus of the publications. So we're doing this with Neotoma right now. We know, most of the data that comes into Neotoma is user submitted. And so someone will publish a paper, they'll say, we want you to use our pollen data and have it available through Neotoma. But we know that a lot of that never gets into the database. So we started working with Deep Dive, with Geo Deep Dive, to actually train the system how to recognize a paper that contains pollen data, and how to recognize the latitudes and longitudes within that paper, and then how to recognize the taxon names. So that then we can basically go out and start mining the literature and saying, okay, you've searched for pollen data, here's the stuff we have in our database, but here's a whole bunch of sites out there as well that are in the literature, but which we don't have records for right now. But you will know what time domain they span, what kind of taxa you might find in there, and the location of those sites and the authors of those sites. And so you're way past where you were before, and we've done that not around a specific question, but around a specific problem of how do we actually start recovering some of this dark data from the literature. So I want to get back to this again, because I talked about EarthCube. I want to talk specifically about a project I was involved with called Paleon. And Paleon, again, addresses this big problem of climate change by bringing together individuals from a number of different disciplines to answer a question, or to confront a problem, sorry. And so I don't know how many of you know that this comes from the PMIP work. PMIP 4, I guess this one is. So this Friedlichstein paper basically shows these are predictions of land flux, carbon land flux. So is the biosphere going to become a carbon sink, so when the values are above 0, or is it going to become a carbon source through time in the future? This is critically important. That red bar, that's the annual anthropogenic carbon production, 6.6 petagrams of carbon per year. And so what you see here is that the models are relatively well constrained over the historical period, over the period during which they are calibrated, basically. But as soon as you get out into the future, there's a lot of noise. There's model divergence. This obviously is not the actual figure. I sort of took some artistic license. The blue path is sort of the region where there's the most agreement among the 15 models. And then the orange, there's a couple models that go high, a couple models that go low. But it makes a big difference. Whether or not it's a sink or a source is important, but the degree to which it's a sink and a source is also important. And the problem here is that because each of these models is so computationally intensive to run, we don't oftentimes have uncertainty around those estimates, and we don't know which one is right and which one is wrong. So we wanted to look at this question in more detail, and this is the thinking behind the paleoecological observation network. So we brought together researchers from the earth sciences, ecology, paleoecology, historical ecology, statistics, geography. There's an anthropologist involved as well. And we wanted to start asking, what are the causes of divergence? Is it the basic model assumptions? Is it the driver data sets that these models use? Is it the components that they use? Or is it just some sort of uncertainty, some unknowable element that we can't really get at? And the way that we wanted to start answering these questions is by confronting these models with paleoecological data. So rather than just running them forward into a time period for which we have no empirical data, we want to start them 2,000 years ago and start running them forward. And at any point in time here, we can confront them with paleoecological data and say, are you doing a good job of matching what we know about the environment at that time? And if you are, that's great. We'll let you keep running forward. And if you're not, we'll stop you. We'll look at why you're not doing a good job, and we'll retool the model, and then we'll let you run again, and we'll see how you do. And this is really complicated because the data is really complicated. So this is the part of the work I did. We needed to build a model of what vegetation in the northeastern United States looked like prior to European settlement. And so we did that using the public land survey system. So when they, after Louisiana Purchase, they divided up the land in the United States into these 1 by 1 mile sections. And they sent out surveyors, and they recorded the kinds of trees that they found at the corners of those sections. So here they found a black oak with a bearing of 8 north, 86 degrees east, 68 feet from the 68 chains from the center of the post, of the point. And they did this across the entire western United States. And using this information, we can derive estimates of composition prior to Euro-American settlement. Because we know how far away the trees were from the posts, we can actually derive estimates of stem density prior to Euro-American settlement. And because they also recorded the diameters of the trees, we can actually generate estimates of biomass on the landscape prior to widespread Euro-American settlement. And we can use these to calibrate our paleoecological records because a lot of times we just have pollen here, and so we can't estimate things like biomass. And so we can start asking specific testable questions about the assumptions that these models are making. So we can say, are modern forests actually representative? So when we're calibrating some of the biological features of these models against modern forests, are these modern forests really representative of the state of forests? Are the species-climate relationships that we're using in these models stable? And were pre-settlement forests in a stable state prior to the beginning, prior to Euro-American settlement? Because a stable state is often a base assumption for a lot of these GCMs. They run them up and let them run for like 10,000 years until the vegetation layer gets to a stable state, and then they run them forward using the climate drivers over the historical period and into the future. So this was a paper we published in the Public Library of Science. We can talk a lot about why this is an extremely complicated, why this kind of interdisciplinary work is extremely complicated and hard to get published. But basically, this is what forests looked like prior to Euro-American settlement. I'm not going to go into too much about that. What I will talk about is the representativity of these forests. Are they actually representative of modern forests? No. Or are modern forests representative of historical forests? No. 25% of forests at the pre-settlement era no longer appear in the upper Midwestern United States. We've lost entire forest communities that were there and were major features of the landscape. It's reduced the average carbon retention time in the forests by a factor of almost 100 years. So carbon is cycled much more rapidly now in forests. And we've gained a whole set of novel forest communities that were not there prior to Euro-American settlement. And this is extremely important because the other thing you notice is that the lost forests are highly spatially structured. The novel forests are not structured at all. There's very little spatial autocorrelation in them. So there's been significant vegetation change in the region since Euro-American settlement. What are the implications of that? Well, if we actually look at the relationship between land use change and climate change in the region over time, we find another really interesting pattern. Land use change is spatially biased. Yeah, I'm going to be really quick, I guess. Land use change is spatially biased in the region, which results in a climatic bias for the species envelopes in the region. So what we see is that now modern tree species actually are occupying warmer winter temperatures but cooler summer temperatures than they used to because they've lost the warmest parts of their domain to land use change. And so we sort of do this analysis. I'm going to just skip that. But we came up with a really nice, a really elegant solution to actually partition the causes of those shifts, how much of it had to do with land use change and how much of it had to do with sort of large-scale cyclic climate change in the region. And we can see that certainly some of these shifts just happen because climate is changing over time. But some of these actually happen because of systematic biases in land use change. And so then we've sort of answered these two questions, that climate-vegetation relationships are changing, that also modern forests are not representative of past forests. We can now use the pollen record calibrated against the pre-settlement vegetation data, and we can start to build maps of significant changes in vegetation through time. So these are the time bins on the side. This is a significant, well, we can go over here. So this is a significant shift in, for example, hemlock between 2,100 years in the past and 1,100 years in the past. If you go diagonally up, you can sort of see the sequential changes. And you see that these changes don't happen very quickly because there's not a lot of change directly on the diagonal, but they are happening on sort of multi-centennial scales till you get to the point where over the past 2,000 years there have been major shifts in oak. This ends prior to Euro-American settlement. There have been major shifts in oak, hemlock, pine, all in that region in a period that we generally assume to be relatively climatically stable. So forests were changing at centennial scales, and this is really important. Because when you actually get to the models and start looking at how the models interpret vegetation relationships and climate relationships, this is work I did with Jacqueline Mathis, we basically see that for a lot of evergreen taxa in some of these models, they're doing no better than random at placing those taxa into the proper climate space. And so this leads to, and so when we actually look at the models and what that causes, this leads to errors in simulated albedo, net primary productivity, and transpiration for those models in this domain in the northeastern United States. So the fact that we're not capturing this vegetation data properly is really critically important to our interpretations of what's happening with future climate. And so I hope you'll agree that these are important findings, and they couldn't have been done without this kind of problem-based approach. And so by integrating all these groups together, we can come to an agreement about how this data should be handled and what kinds of methods we should use. And it's really important that I was part of this because I work with Neotoma really closely. And so I can bring in the best practices from the community curated repository. And so this is sort of a schematic of what Neotoma looks like with the different databases. You can see that each of these circles is a different constituent database, so it's actually a database of databases. But we had to do a lot of work to do this analysis. For example, those of you who know about paleoecology, we take these long sediment cores, but we need to associate depth with time, so we build these chronologies using radiocarbon dates. And if you look at the data content within Neotoma, a lot of these records are just dated in radiocarbon years, which tend to look a lot younger than they would be if they're calibrated against the radiocarbon curve, because carbon-14 in the atmosphere is a function of solar winds. Solar winds fluctuate through time, and so we can use dated material to actually calibrate these models. We had to make sure that all of this data used a standard time format, and so we spent probably, like generously, 4 months of continuous work just updating the age models in all of these records. And we couldn't have done it without a community curated data resource. We built an API for the Neotoma database and then built an R package so that we could access data in real time and bring it into our workflow to make a reproducible workflow. Now anyone can do it. And that's best practices. We followed best practices to do this. So now people who need to do this again either can use our data set, which has been generated with a standard method, or this is all published, all our work is published on GitHub, and so they can just download it. Or they can come to our workshops, which are really fun and exciting. And so what we can do then is we can give best practices to each of these domains now. We can say, here, just come, oh yeah, actually, wait a second. Did I do this? Oh yeah, and so, anyway, oh yeah, no, that's the link. Should I don't know if we got time. Okay, here, let's see if this works. So we basically generated these web pages that show you exactly how to do it and show you how to do it in real time. They're generated with R and R Markdown, so you could actually just run it live. It will work, it will rebuild it, and you get these results. We also find these crazy, we also ran into a whole bunch of crazy data problems. So these are just sort of, this is just a figure, it's not important what it shows, but there's a whole bunch of outliers there. And when we started looking at the outliers, we're like, this doesn't make sense. But we started asking some of the principal investigators, or people who knew the principal investigators, because in some cases those people were dead. And they said, oh yeah, this is this is because they blew off the top of the core. They just sort of sunk the, you use a core. They blew off the top of the core and just assumed that they had maybe lost 200 years of sediment. Turns out it was 2,000 years of sediment. But that information is not in the database. And we only found it because we asked. But if someone didn't know who to ask, what are you going to do? They would have crazy results. And so we started thinking about, how do we fix this entropy curve? And so this brought on a new project, which just like today we just got funded. We just got the notice that we knew, whatever. So it was unimportant about the order of things. But this is a new project called Throughput. And the idea of Throughput is to connect an individual to a collection of data resources in a relatively seamless way so that people can actually annotate the data, make the data discoverable, make the data connected, so that you can provide information to anyone else who is going to work with that data. So within Neotoma, we have DOIs for all our data records. What this system is going to do is, it's effectively credentialed, curated, credentialed crowdsourcing. So I find out that they've blown off the top of this core, and it's a problematic data set. I tag that data. My user ID, my ORCID, gets linked to it. The text gets linked to it. It's in a separate database, so it's not actually tied to Neotoma. So anyone who aggregates Neotoma data, as long as they're linking to that DOI, that unique identifier, they can find this, and this becomes discoverable. And this is really important because another project we're doing is starting to say, well, there are some common data sets, things like tephras, volcanic ashes, that appear not only in neotoma as chronological markers, but they appear in ocean core data, they appear in ice records, and those are held in different data repositories. But if we can start linking those together, then we can start doing some really cool things. We can start really constraining time across all of these resources. And if we do it using these unique identifiers, things like DOIs as sort of the currency for this linking, then we can build any sort of system that we want to on top of it. It can be independent, which makes it much more sustainable because anyone can work on it. And it can share data across an ecosystem of disciplines and across an ecosystem of research projects and data repositories. And so this is really cool. I'm super excited. I'm really excited to be working on that. And we're working with some really great people. And this is one of the things about interdisciplinary science. I don't know about you, but I'm always super jealous about what other people are working on because it seems like everyone is working on such really cool stuff. And if you start doing interdisciplinary science, you don't have to learn all the background that they had to slog through. You just get to learn the best stuff that they do and use that to make your projects better. And you can contribute your expertise to their projects to make them better. So we need new solutions to start answering these big questions and to start doing them in reproducible and open ways. And that is what a lot of people are starting to recognize. And so I've had some really good discussions with people I think UBC is really at the forefront of this in a lot of ways. But there are a lot of large organizations as well that are getting involved in this and really thinking about these questions in new ways. And it still seems, though, that this is a bit divided. This is the geoscience domain, or this is sort of the data science domain, and it's not quite filtering down in the way that I would hope it would. But it is happening, and things are changing, and if you're in grad school right now, it's a really exciting time, I would hope, because there's a lot of new stuff that's available to you that wasn't available to us. So getting back to this, I think again, we can acknowledge that climate change is a huge problem. And the great opportunity that we have is to bring all these people together around these kinds of questions to generate a new understanding of the solutions that we need, so that it's not just a solution focused on economics, it's not just a solution focused on ecology, it's a solution that takes into account everyone's voices to come up with an equitable solution to addressing climate change in the future. And that is my well over time talk. So thank you very much. Questions?
Two, perhaps, from the students?
It's awesome when you cover everything really well. I'll take your question first.
So I really love this idea of having people really talking to each other across these diverse disciplines, but I've encountered in practice that it's really difficult, especially when you have disciplines that are fundamentally across your spectrum, what kind of questions you ask. And what's a valid way of interpreting data? How do you grapple with that across really deeply divided fields like that?
So it is really difficult, and that is the demise of a lot of projects. I think that there are, if you start looking in the literature about team science, they talk a lot about bridge people who are at the interface of multiple disciplines, as being really critical members to help resolve some of these issues. Within Paleon, we had some problems like temperature. It seems like a fairly basic concept, right? But what paleoecologists talk about when they talk about temperature, when they talk about July temperature, is not actually what a climate modeler thinks of as July temperature. And we weren't exactly at crosshairs, but we just didn't realize that we were talking about different things. So we would have these discussions and we would all feel like everything had been resolved, and then people would go away and come back with their data products, and this problem would arise again. and we'd have these discussions, and we were using the same terminology, but there was a different sort of philosophical underpinning behind the terminology we were using. We would have these problems and resolve them and go away and come back and have the problems again. And it wasn't until we had someone who had worked with both paleoecological records and the modeling data who could actually step in and say, hey, like, I think I understand what's going on here, and I think that this is what you're saying and this is what you're saying. And it turns out we're building a new model to actually reconstruct climate from paleoecological data to be able to work into this data assimilation procedure with some of these ecosystem modelers. And so it's not enough to just bring the people to the table. You have to bring the people to the table in a way that will actually facilitate that kind of interdisciplinary work. And so for that, these bridge people are critically important. And this is somewhat problematic in academia because we tend to want people who are disciplinarily deep, right? We sort of say, like, don't be a jack of all trades, be like a master of one. But we need these people who are, to some degree, jacks of all trades, because they can take some of the information that they know from these different disciplines and use that to facilitate these kinds of capacity building exercises. Is that?
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't have a specific answer for like that particular case. I think that a lot of it is just hard work, right? And sometimes sometimes it is, sometimes it's the people you're working with, right? And sometimes it just takes coming to the realization that you need a different way of working with that data. Right? I mean, maybe the reason you have those fundamental philosophical differences is because they just don't work together, and you need to look for a different solution. So, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. That was very interesting. I was struck when you were talking about data discoverability, about, if you're looking at different climate data, how do you know what's better, how do you know what the pitfalls of that are? And potentially one challenge with having these big databases that have so much data is that somebody, and I guess a larger challenge in interdisciplinary research is if I can pull up a data set, but I have no comprehension of what that really means, what the pitfalls in that data are. It seems like a potential pitfall in publicly available data that's outside of your discipline.
Right.
I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that is that's a problem that we struggle with in Neotoma, for example. So because we curate the database, we see lots of people using it, and it's great. We want the data to be publicly available. But not everyone is going to understand how to use the data and what it means. Pollen data in particular is very idiomatic. It looks like composition data. You have percentages of pine and spruce and like birch pollen, and so it looks like you could say, yeah, pine goes up and then down through time. But in the specific case anyways, pollen data is affected as much by the depositional environment in which it's captured. So is the pollen falling into a lake? Is it falling into a bog? How big is the lake? What kinds of trees are around there? We know that in general pine produces way more pollen than other trees. And so that has issues of representativity. And sometimes people just take the pollen data at face value. And they will look at a bunch of sites and say, this is what, I've reviewed papers and been like, you need to work with someone who's actually worked with pollen data before. You can't stop people from working with data, right? And I think that's critically important to know. There are databases that are closed. The TRI database, which is plant trait database, I think you need to actually send them, I'm pretty sure it's TRI, there's two, but you have to send them like a proposal about why you want to use the data and the specific kinds of data. But that's not really open. Like, there's a gatekeeper at that point who's saying, yes, you can work with this data, no, you can't. And I mean, maybe that works, but I feel like philosophically that's a little, I don't know. I'm not interested in that. But at the same time, there needs to be some sort of vetting in terms of the use, and we would hope that the community can do that, but the community can't always do that. You don't always get the right two reviewers. And it does become problematic. I think the best thing you can do is to try and make sure that the data resource is well documented, and so we have an online manual about, one, how the database actually is framed. There are obviously key pieces of literature out there, but regardless, like, we don't stop people from using linear regression because some people abuse it. There just has to be this self-correcting mechanism, and we have to hope that it works. And sometimes it doesn't. And I don't think that there's too much you can do with that. I think we definitely get into ethical issues for sure. Like, so with the paleobiology database, there's an issue about dinosaur hunters. So by exposing latitudes and longitudes, so I mean, so there's this question about, like, what is ethical in terms of open data? Do we make available all the information about dinosaur localities, like fossil localities, because maybe that's encouraging fossil hunters to go out there and start mining those fossils, and they're not available anymore because they go onto the black market. With Neotoma, we deal, a lot of information comes from archaeological sites. And so what do we do about that? We want to make it available because it's important information. So we actually mask the latitudes and longitudes. Instead of providing point locations, we provide a bounding box. But if you don't know why that's the case, then, if you're not using the data set with your eyes open, then maybe that's a problem. And that's sort of what I was talking about big data. Like, you do need to use care in terms of how you're working with the data. The problem is it often does, the fundamental fact, I feel, is that we oftentimes propose these large interdisciplinary projects, and I've been part of it. As PIs, we come together with other people in different departments or different institutions and have these great ideas, all going to work together, and it's like 2 grad students who do all the work because we've got to write our next grants, and we're teaching, and like whatever. And it's difficult, right? I mean, you can't, like, you're a grad student, you've got to, sorry, we're done. Anyway, Kai doesn't like what I'm saying. But I guess all I'm saying is that, like, we need to think about new ways of answering these questions and working together, because it can't keep falling onto one person. The expertise, the capacity just isn't there for 1 or 2 people to do this kind of research.
That's great. I think we should probably end it.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Simon.
Thanks, everyone. Are we going to go for coffee?